I'm happy to be with you, and I admire your courage to continue your studies in very difficult times. And I hope that today, at least, it will be somewhat quiet over Kiev, and you don't have to flee because of drone attacks. Anyhow, I studied business and economics at the Vienna University of Business and Economics. The reason why I studied in Vienna is partly because I was born in Vienna. My mother is Austrian, and I say is because she still lives with an age of 103 years, and my father was German. So I'm a mixture, so to speak, of a German and Austrian. Studied in Vienna. Then after finishing my studies, I went to Fontainebleau, where the Harvard Business School had founded the first business school in Europe called INSEAD. And there I got my Master of Business Administration. And then I started a business career, a rather international business career that had a number of international stays. I've started out in London, then worked in the USA, worked in Finland, again in Germany, Austria, France, and finally was a member of the executive board of a Swiss corporation. In the beginning of my career, I worked for the consulting company McKinsey & Company, and there I became a partner. Then, as I said, I was hired away by a client in Switzerland. After German unification in 1990, I went to Berlin and was a member of the executive board of the Treuhandanstalt, which was the agency, the government agency that was charged with the privatization of East German industry. As you know, very much like in the Ukraine as well, during a communist government, the whole industry and all business was nationalized. And after unification, we wanted to turn this market, this centrally organized and run economy, turn it into private enterprises. And so we were given that task to do it, which was not that easy, because the companies were not in very good shape, but anyhow, we did it. And after that, I went back to business, became again a member of the board of a privately held company, and finally the chief executive officer of a company that was listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And when my last contract came to an end, I decided it's too early to retire, and I want to do something else. So I went into politics and campaigned for becoming a member of the European Parliament, and I was successful and spent 15 years in the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. And then finally I did retire, but I resumed a new job last year, again in Brussels, where I took over the chairmanship of the EFRAG Financial Reporting Board. That is the board that defines the standards that companies of the European Union that are listed on the stock market have to respect and apply when they publish their business results at the end of the year. So that's in a nutshell what I've been doing, and so I'm glad to see you today. I would have liked to be in front of you in person, but given the war times, of course, this is not possible. I hope that the next time round, maybe in spring or summer next year, we can meet in person. Thank you. So.
Yes, sure. It will be like this. Thank you very much for your introduction. Yes.
Okay, shall we go on?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, okay, so I now come to the topic that I want to discuss with you today, and that is the policy of the European Central Bank. Now, you know that the European Central Bank has been set up 25 years ago, and officially the euro, the currency that the Euro Central Bank issues, is the official currency of all member states. In reality, of course, not all 27 member states have introduced the euro as yet. When the euro started, the ECB had 11 members. Then that number grew continuously, and by now the number of members adhering to the eurozone has risen to 20. We still have a few that have not joined yet, even though legally each member of the European Union is bound to introduce the euro. They all have pledged to introduce it, with the exception of Denmark. Denmark had an opt-out position, very much like the UK at the time when the UK was still a member of the European Union. But de facto, Denmark is linked to the euro because they have pegged the Danish crown, the currency of Denmark, to the euro. In other words, when the euro fluctuates and gains in value or decreases in value, the Danish crown does exactly the same. So normally you would say a sovereign currency represents the collective characteristics of the nation that issues that currency. If you take that definition, the euro is not a sovereign currency in that sense, because it is issued by a single bank, but it has, as I said, a number of different founding members and current members, and therefore it is the currency of sovereign member states that still have their own fiscal responsibility. From the very beginning, therefore, the central bank, the European Central Bank, was different from other central banks. It is, of course, very much like any central bank, responsible for defending this financial stability of its members, but it is having the difficult task to defend financial stability or monetary stability in an environment where you have 20 member states that are sovereign in their fiscal policy. In other words, when it comes to taxes and other measures of the fiscal domain, the central bank has no say, and therefore it is quite a difficult task. I should say this approach to have a single currency with politically sovereign and independent member states. This approach has been tried in history a few times. The most known is the so-called Latin currency or monetary union, but in the past, in history, it has not worked out. In other words, the Latin currency union lasted a few decades, but then disappeared. Now, the European Central Bank, when it was created, was supposed to work like the German Central Bank, like the Bundesbank. It was independent, or is independent from political influence, at least in theory. It has one single mandate, and that is to defend and ensure monetary stability. And at the time when it was created, the monetary stability was defined as inflation should be close to, but not higher than 2% per year. Each and every year, the objective was, let's have an inflation that is just below 2%, close to, but 2%. In other words, 1.9, 1.95, etc. So already a very low inflation of, say, 1% was considered to be outside of the mandate. Now, the tool for ensuring the control of inflation is, and that is generally true, is to stimulate the economy in times of a cooling off or recession or deflation period, i.e. it would, in that case, it would increase interest rates to fight inflationary pressure when the economy overheats. There's a difference between the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States of America, and the European Central Bank, because the Federal Reserve Bank has also an average, an inflation target of 2% on average. In other words, in America, the Fed says if we have 2% this year and 2.5% next year, on average, that would be 2.25. So we have to do something to get close to 2%. But as long as the average is 2%, they are happy. In other words, if you have 1.5% one year and 2.5% next year, the average will be 2%, so it's fine. And there's a huge difference. The Fed also is responsible for ensuring or facilitating full employment or eliminating unemployment, whatever you want to say. And the unemployment rate should not exceed 4.5%. So in summary then, financial stability means no or little inflation. In America, for many years, the inflation was 0 or 1%, and it was okay in the USA. This has changed now. Now the Fed wants to achieve 2% on average, not necessarily in a particular year, but as I said already, but on average over several years. That means that if inflation is below 2% for some years, it can be higher than 2% in the following years. The Fed is also responsible for the full employment, as I said, and the unemployment rate should not be higher than 4.5%. And here we see a difference. In the beginning, when the European Central Bank started, the European Central Bank had an objective of having an inflation close to, but below 2%, so very close to 2% per year. In other words, not as an average over many years, but each and every year, the objective was set. That was also the objective that the Bundesbank had at the time. Now, the ECB differs from the Fed in many ways. As I said already, the European Central Bank is a central bank of 20 independent sovereign states. And that of course, is quite a difficult task because the fiscal policy of each and every of those 20 member states is different. Now, to ensure that nonetheless the European Central Bank could work as a single bank for 20 member states, it was decided that the member states should adhere to or respect certain criteria and certain requirements. And when they joined the Eurozone, they were supposed to meet the following criteria: 3%, not more than 3% of new debt, 3% of the gross national product. In other words, if a country joins, it was supposed not to have a national debt in that particular year or each and every year of more than 3%. It was supposed to have not more accumulated more than 60% of the GDP as cumulated debt, and not more than 1.5% higher inflation than the best 3 member states of the Eurozone. And it was also agreed there should be no bailout. In other words, if a country runs into difficulties and cannot meet its fiscal requirements, then it was forbidden, as a matter of fact, legally forbidden, that other member states could come to rescue. Now, these are the criteria, and then I should say this is the theory, because already when the Eurozone was created in 1998, already then some of the new member states did not meet those criteria. In particular, Belgium and Italy had more than 100% of their GDP as debt. They were not respecting the 60%. They had more than 100% debt. And also France was not respecting the 3% of new debt because it had higher debt and simply managed to bring this number down by an advanced dividend payment by the France Telecom. So Greece cheated when it joined the Eurozone, with the help of Goldman Sachs, they simply classified military expense, which they had, not as an expense, but as an investment. Anyhow, so we see that the foundation of the common currency in Europe were clear, but already in the beginning, from the very beginning, they were not fully respected by the member states. But anyhow, it was clear that the mandate was obvious, close to, but just below 2% inflation, and that each and every year, not as an average over several years. Now, it became, when you see that many countries did not manage to respect those criteria, it became clear that from the very beginning, the euro has been a political project. It's not just a monetary or economic project, it has been and still is a highly political project. And therefore, in a way, it is a symbol, also in the eyes of the citizens. It is a symbol of Europe growing together, of Europe integrating. And I must say, even though in the beginning, many citizens were rather skeptical as to the value of a common currency, by now, when you have a survey and ask the citizens, are you satisfied with the common currency, or would you like to have the former currencies back, the lira or the French franc or the Deutschmark? The majority of the people now says, well, we are quite happy to have a common currency. Now, fortunately, in the beginning of the Eurozone, the inflation was relatively low. So there was not an extremely pressure on the bank to ensure that objective close to, but just below 2%. That was the case. In fact, in the first years after the introduction of the euro, the inflation rate of the euro was, on average, somewhat lower than the Deutschmark inflation rate had been when the Bundesbank still was in charge of the currency in Germany. The citizens, however, and that is quite an interesting statement or observation, in each and every country that introduces the euro, the citizens have the feeling that when the common currency is being introduced, the prices go up, and there is a kind of inflationary development. We have in German a word for expensive, and that word is teuer. And when the euro was introduced and replaced the Deutschmark in Germany, we called the euro teuro, because we said everything goes up. But in reality, only in some sectors did the prices go up, particularly in the service sector, the prices soared. But others, particularly technical products, etc., in fact, did not only not increase in prices, but even came down. And that is, of course, the result of productivity gains that led to price reduction. So when you read the statistics, you have to realize that even though citizens felt that the introduction of the euro did increase the price level, in reality, when you look at the statistics, that was not the case. And prices were relatively stable, and inflation in the beginning after the introduction of the euro was okay. Now, the ECB had quite difficult times to survive. Namely, it had to meet the attack, so to speak, of three different crises since the beginning. As I said, it started in June '98. In the beginning, it was only used for financial transaction in the financial and banking sector. 3 years later, 2001, it was introduced in coins and bills for each and every citizen. So it has been in existence even for the average citizen for more than 20 years now. The ECB had to adjust its monetary policy when reacting to three crises. The first crisis was the global financial crisis in 2007 and 8. And I'll come to those crises in a minute. Then the second crisis was the so-called euro or public debt crisis between 2009 and 2011, primarily. And then we had, in the beginning of this decade, we had the Corona crisis, 2020 and 21. Now let's just look at those three crises in a minute, just briefly. The global financial crisis, also called the so-called subprime crisis, originated in the USA. It was caused by unjustifiable real estate financing, helped by securitizing loans and selling them around the world. Now, what does this mean? This means that in America, the government wanted pretty much each and everybody to have the possibility to acquire real estate, buy a flat or even buy a home. And they wanted this also to be possible for low-income groups, be it colored groups, be it indigenous groups, whatever. They wanted that pretty much everybody could fulfill the so-called American dream and own his own a flat or house. Therefore, the government encouraged the banks and the financial sector to offer loans to people that normally, were borderline. Normally, maybe the bank would have refused to give them a loan. And how they did it? The banks offered those loans, then took the individual loans. Some were of good quality, some were of sort of questionable quality. We were talking about the first so-called financial crisis that happened between 2007 and 2008, when the financial system, not the least upon recommendation of the US government, offered banking financing and loans to people that normally could not afford such a loan. And in order to get to ensure refinancing, the banks repackaged all those loans into new financial products which they sold. So these new financial products consisted of several tranches. Some were excellent, some were poor or of minor quality. And that worked reasonably well through so-called securitization for a number of years. But then finally it collapsed. And you as young students, so you don't recall, but your parents may recall that a well-known investment bank in the USA by the name of Lehman Brothers went under, collapsed. Another one like Merrill Lynch had to be taken over by the Bank of America, otherwise it would have also collapsed. And all the big US banks had to be recapitalized. They were forced to accept recapitalization by the government. In the meantime, they paid back those government aid. And also in Europe, that led to recapitalization of several banks. The public debt level increased massively. The interest rates stayed, however, low to facilitate credit lending. And sorry, but the real economy also was heavily hit. A company like General Motors, at the time, one of the largest, if not the largest automobile manufacturer in the world, filed for bankruptcy. And I must say, I myself personally had invested in a bank loan, in a company loan, in a company bond, I should say, rather, that GM had introduced in the market, because I thought that was a very secure loan, secure bond. But in reality, when GM collapsed, I also lost my invested money in that bond, as many thousands of small and community banks collapsed and disappeared. So it was a real crisis. And it proved that the real estate policy of the government had been wrong. The interest rate had been too low for too long a time. There was a lax regulation of the banking sector. practically no regulation of the so-called shadow banking sector, and the rating agencies had not warned early enough that those artificially produced financial products as a result of the securitization were in fact a rather dangerous investment tool. So the US had to come to the rescue of the economy by launching massive rescue actions. They introduced several acts, laws, in other words, in total amounted to more than $1 trillion. So a number of men. That was the first crisis. And of course, that had also an impact on the European market, because those securitized products were also offered and sold in Europe. And therefore, the European countries also had to produce or decide on rescue packages that went into the billions of euros. The second crisis was the so-called euro crisis. And the euro crisis had nothing to do with the USA, and we could not excuse ourselves saying, well, this crisis originated in the USA and has come to Europe as well. The euro crisis started in Europe, period, nowhere else. And it started when Greece announced that, in fact, the public debt per year at the time was not 6%, as indicated by the last government, but it was at least twice as high. In other words, 12 plus. Since there was no bailout clause, as I said, no other country was permitted to come to the rescue. Everybody thought that sooner or later this will lead to the bankruptcy of the Greek government and will lead to Greece being forced to leave the common currency area, okay? Now, how did this happen? It happened for the following reasons. In the old time, when Greece still had its own currency, the drachma, Greece had to pay substantially higher interest rates when it floated bonds. In other words, when Greece floated a bond, and Germany, for instance, had to pay, say, 4% for its Deutschmark bonds, then Greece had to pay 4 or 5% more, 8 or 9%. And when Greece floated a bond denominated in Deutschmark, it was also up to 5% high. All of a sudden, now that Greece was member of the European currency, the markets did not believe that the no bailout clause would really be respected. So they said, okay, it's the same currency, so therefore the rates should also be, if not identical, they should be very close to each other. So Greece all of a sudden did not have to pay 5% more for its bonds compared to Germany, but maybe only 2% more. And that, of course, meant that Greece could indebt itself and not pay more interest rates. In other words, when you have a debt of 100 million and you pay 10% interest rates, then you pay 10 million interest every year. If that interest rate is not 10%, but 6%, you pay only 60 million. You pay only 6 million. And therefore, if you are used to paying 10 million in interest rates, you can afford to have a higher debt than the original 100 million. So in other words, for the same interest level that you pay per year, all of a sudden you could indebt yourself almost twice as high as before. And that is what Greece did. They sort of were not tough enough to withstand the temptation to stay with the traditional debt level. They increased the debt level, sometimes for good purposes, investment, etc., but also for other social benefits, and all of a sudden realized that the debt level ballooned. You know, they were far away from the 6% debt level of, or 60% debt level of total GDP. So public and private debt expanded rapidly. And there were tremendous, massive, and increasing current account differences between the common currency countries. Now, the other problem was that the wages increased substantially as well, because the wages increased far beyond the productivity gains. And that, of course, was also a situation that could not last very long, because all of a sudden there was no possibility to devalue the currency. The southern countries in Europe, be it Portugal or Spain or Italy or Greece, they had been used in the past to, whenever their competitiveness was under pressure, they were used to devalue the currency. They devalued the currency, and all of a sudden they were competitive again. This was now impossible. There was no possibility to devalue, because they all had the same currency, namely the euro. And that, of course, put tremendous pressure on the European Central Bank, because the European Central Bank had no interest of losing a member. You know, the European Central Bank was, of course, legally committed to guaranteeing monetary stability. On the other hand, of course, they said, even though it was not pre-written in the treaty, they said, well, we have to do whatever is possible to make sure that the currency survives. You know, if the currency as such is in danger, then we have to take measures that are maybe hors du commun, as the French would say, that are out of the normal, but we have to do it. And this is what Draghi said, for instance, when the pressure was too high. Draghi, the then president of the European Central Bank, said in a speech in London, we will do whatever it takes to defend the euro. And whatever it takes, of course, means that we'll even do things that are, for the time being, not foreseen. And in fact, the bailout, as I said, was officially or legally not possible. But the Eurozone member states developed an alternative support to help the so-called GIPS countries. The GIPS countries, GIPS means G for Greece, I for Italy, I for Ireland, P for Portugal, and S for Spain, the GIPS countries. They all, at the time when the euro crisis started, were in serious trouble. So the Eurozone developed, or the European Union, I should even say, developed the following programs. They developed the so-called European Financial Stability Facility, the European Financial Stability Facility, that had a bracket, that had a volume of 400 billion, that could, through guarantees, be increased to 700 billion. They had the European Financial Stability Mechanism. There was another 60 billion from the EU budget. And then in 2012, they introduced a more lasting program, the so-called European Stability Mechanism. That is a European currency fund with capital of 300 billion euros. That exists even today. And the feeling was summarized by Angela Merkel in the speech at the time. She said, if the euro dies, then Europe dies. Now, that may have been an exaggeration, but it showed that, again, the company heads, and including Angela Merkel, the then Chancellor of Germany, the euro is a political project, and we do, and a very important European political project. We cannot afford to let it die. So we do something that has not been foreseen in any contract or in any treaty, but we do it now. And this is why they came up with the EFSF, the EFSM. The EFSM it ended in 2012, but it was replaced by the European Stability Mechanism, which is important. So then, of course, following that, and following what Mario Draghi did when he said, whatever it takes, we will defend the euro, the European Central Bank started what is called the quantitative easing project. In other words, even though it was legally forbidden to monetize public debt, they did it indirectly. In other words, the ECB did not say, well, if Greece wants to issue a bond, then we'll buy it and therefore give the money to Greece. They said we buy it in the market. So in other words, but Greece knew, and the other countries as well, if I float a bond and my banking sector buys that bond, then we all know, I, a government and the banking sector know that the European Central Bank will then pick up those bonds and take them off the books of the banks. The result of that is, of course, that the balance sheet of the European Central Bank grew and grew and grew and was massive. By now, the European Central Bank, when it reached the peak, had monetized a large number of the public debt of the governments. You know, in some cases, more than 70% of the public debt had been monetized by the European Bank buying it. That was the second crisis. And that was probably the most severe. And I must say, if it hadn't been for Mario Draghi and those I wouldn't say illegal, but yeah, in a way, say those measures that were at least against the requirements of the contract of Maastricht, probably the euro would have tumbled. The last crisis is the one that you, as young students, will remember, because that's the crisis that you lived through, namely the Corona crisis, 2 and 3 years ago when it started. And here again, the European Union did the first something that was really unusual, namely they decided to launch a rescue program with European bonds. First time. So far, each and every country, since it insisted on being sovereign and have its own fiscal policies, own treasury, etc. Here now, the first time, the European Union started to issue bonds through the European Commission. And that was a level, the so-called European Recovery Fund, 750 billion, 360 billion of that were loans, the rest could be credit. And that was, again, de facto a violation of the no bailout clause, because it did lead to transfers of debt financing. On the other hand, and that's why a number of countries, 4 countries in the beginning, were against it, and it could take effect only when it was ratified by 100% of the member states. So in the beginning, Austria, Netherlands, Sweden, and Finland were kind of hesitant to go along, but finally it was ratified. And that led to the so-called PEP program, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program. Now, why was that necessary? It was necessary because the Corona crisis led to severe problems in the economy of the member states. There was a decrease of trade with China because China had serious problems. That's where the virus started in the first place. They all of a sudden were faced with a I wouldn't say collapse, but with a stagnation of economy. The value chain that included a lot of elements coming from China, from Asia, was disrupted. There was no or little growth, and we had a number of zombie firms that had been financed through the cheap quantitative easing programs, and all of a sudden turned out to be in difficulties, and we had inflationary pressure. So what we had is, during the euro crisis, when the quantitative easing started, we had little or no inflation. The inflation was clearly below 2%, in some cases even close to 0, and at one point in time, 2015, there was even a negative inflation or a deflation of 0.5%. And that's why the ECB said, okay, if the inflation rate is so low and I'm not close to the target of 2%, then I can lower interest rates. And the bank lowered the interest rates to a level of almost 0. You know, you could, even as a private person, you could borrow money for 0.5 percentage point for a number of years. Now, with Corona starting, all of a sudden, the inflation started to develop again. And we have now, over the last years, we've had an inflation that moved up to 2-digit numbers. In some countries, inflation was close to 20%. In other countries, it was at least 10 or 11%. And the Eurozone as a whole also was close to 10%. It's coming down now, and it's coming down now because the ECB finally realized that it had, in order to sort of do what it is forced to do by law, namely ensure financial stability, it had to increase the interest rates to fight inflation. When inflation gets out of control, that has disastrous effects. There is no growth. There is a lot of insolvencies. There is a lack of trust of businesses and companies. Many companies that turned out to be marginal before go under, and there is hesitant to invest because all of a sudden the investors are no longer convinced that their project will be profitable. So in those circumstances, the ECB said, okay, we now have to sit back and take a very close look at our strategy and see what do we have to change, if anything. So you recall that the objective had been, the mandate was ensure financial stability and nothing else. In the US, it was ensure financial stability plus ensure economic growth and unemployment to be not higher than 4.5%. So here was already a difference in the objective. The ECB had only financial stability. Now, all of a sudden, they looked at this and said, maybe we should change our objectives. And they had a strategic review process that started in 2020, and that was finished by the end of 21, so in other words, lasted 2 years. And they came to the following conclusion. They said the quantitative definition of price stability that we've had in the past did work reasonably well, but we want to also modify it. And rather than saying our objective should be to maintain an inflation of just under 2%, but close to 2%, each and every year, they said very much like the Fed in the USA, we want to have 2% flat, not close to and just below, 2%, but on average over a number of years. Now that seems to be not that much of a difference, but in reality it is, because what it says is, if we have an inflation of 1.5% 1 year, we can afford to have an inflation of 2.5% the next year, because on average that is then still 2%. So in other words, it gives the bank the flexibility to live with a higher inflation for a number of years, even on the basis that they will eventually have inflation below 2% and come to that average. That was number one. The second one, they also looked into the question, should we, as European Central Bank, also be responsible for ensuring full employment or unemployment not being higher than so and so much? And thirdly, they said, should we do something for the ecological sustainability? Should ecological sustainability also become objective of the ECB monetary policy? Now, that means that, for instance, should they prefer bonds to be ecology-based rather than simply economic-based? And at the end of the day, they decided formally to change the inflationary target, and they gave up the close to but below 2% and said, okay, 2% on average. But the others, they did not make them part of the official objectives, but they, in reality, they do have them in mind. In other words, the unemployment, growth of the economy, and also the ecological elements are elements that they have in mind. They are not officially part of the objectives, but they are certainly something that they consider in all of the decisions that they take. Now, important is that still do not dominate the fiscal policies of the member states, and there is a certain risk that even if they don't want to do that this will happen, because in good times there is not enough consolidation of the public finances in the member states, and in bad times, of course, due to the monetary union, there is de facto an implicit force to guarantee sustainability of public debt. So there is the risk of dominance of the monetary policy over fiscal policy. And in fact, the public sector purchase program, which they had in the quantitative easing times, is a clear example of this. That in doing so, in financing de facto the budgets of many countries, they did take an influence on the fiscal policy of the member states, which was much. So what conclusion can we draw all of this? And I come to the end now. Probably the ECB should do a kind of proportionality check in the future. In other words, whenever they take a major decision to buy bonds in the market or whatever, they should check whether this is proportional to its objective. The price stability, I think, stays. It is a hierarchical mandate that has proven to be useful. Already the Bundesbank had this as number one goal, and the ECB de facto has accepted this as mandate number one. And the fact that Mario Draghi went a bit further and introduced quantitative easing, and Christine Lagarde, as current president, also continued applying this policy. This had to do primarily with their desire, quite understandable, to defend the euro as a political project, to make sure that the euro currency survives. But there is no official mandate now to support ecological policies and ecological climate-related objectives of the EU. And therefore, they may have this in mind when they take their decision actions, but we have to be careful that they do not go overboard. Climate change and climate policy do have risk for financial stability, and therefore they should not be part of the ECB mandate. Also, there is the eternal question when we define inflation. What is really the proper basket that determines inflation? You can throw all sorts of goods and services into one basket and say the price level has gone up or has stayed even or has even come down. It depends very much what you do, and then the inflation, the definition of inflation, therefore, of the basket is different. And the question now is, since we have a shortage of housing in many cities and in many countries, the question is whether you should not also include the housing cost in the inflationary basket, which is not the case. And the housing cost, of course, have a major impact. And then also, I think probably you should have at regular intervals surveys among the members of the Governing Council of the ECB when it comes to a survey concerning inflation, growth, and interest rate. What we have seen is that the forecasts of how the inflation will develop have been not very accurate. So in other words, the ECB was not in a position to really forecast the inflationary and growth development of the member states accurately, and that certainly could be improved. Now, as I said, the risk that we do have is that the central banks now, and also central banks that still exist in the member states, they have become the biggest creditors of the member states, and therefore there is a tremendous risk of fiscal dominance by the central bank, and that is something that we do not want to have. We do want to have. Whether or not the current setup will be the final end of the development, we'll see. I would not rule out that sooner or later there will be more decisions or actions that will move the European currency members closer together. Even though we say the fiscal sovereignty stays with the member states, I'm not so sure that this will last forever. And de facto, the no bailout, has already been pushed aside by the developments. And so the first common issue of European bonds by the European Commission has been done following the Corona crisis. And we may have, in future, we may see more of those developments. And then, of course, the question comes up, does the Eurozone have a chance to survive without fiscal transfers from the richer countries to the poorer ones? So we'll see this. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Klinz. And dear students, do you have any questions to our speaker? Okay, Anton, please.
Yeah, actually, I have one question to Dr. Klinz. Is it okay?
Yeah, I can see you and hear you. Hello, how are you?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so I wanted to kind of give a little bit of expose before I ask the question. So you've maybe heard recently with, again, the war in Ukraine, right? So, and the question I have is, you know that a lot of monetary foundation organizations, well, for example, the IMF and the European Central Bank, as you mentioned, they've all helped us in aid and gave us credit in order to stabilize our economy. So the question I have, and it's a two-part question. So the first one is, will Ukraine, in your opinion, be able to return the debt for the monetary aid that Europe has given us and maybe also like the International Monetary Fund? And if yes, how do you think we could minimize this debt if you think that we'll be able to return the debt like in the near future, for example? Sorry for the long expose, but...
No. Well, I know that, as we all know, Ukraine is in a very difficult situation, and of course does require aid and subsidies from, you know, the European neighbors, also from the US and from International Monetary Fund, etc. I personally don't think that the Ukraine will be in a position to repay all those credits in the near future. Even if the war ends, the Ukraine will not be in a position to pay this back easily. In fact, if it tried to do so, it would have to indebt itself in a massive way that is not acceptable. So sooner or later, for the time being, those aids are to a large extent credits, to a lesser extent also gifts. But I'm sure that the credits sooner or later will have to be changed into, at least in part, into gifts. In other words, they will be forgiven, so to speak. You know, I don't think that the Ukraine will be in a position and should be forced to pay this back one by one. After the end of the war, of course, there will be a tremendous, I'm sure, tremendous growth potential in the Ukraine, because we've seen this in Germany after the Second World War. All of a sudden, when you reinvest, when you rebuild the country, you rebuild housing, you rebuild the economy, the industry, that will push ahead, and you will see a tremendous growth. And that will enable you to also pay a lot of debt, pay back a lot of the debt, or a lot of the help that you have received. But in reality, this, in my opinion, the overall problem will be resolved only if parts of those credits will be forgiven.
So you're saying some kind of like debt amnesty would help us.
Yes,
basically,
yes,
that's
yes,
one of the
yes,
ways.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for answering my question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klinz, and on a very actual, really current question. Thank you. So, Artem Yacek, please, your floor.
Yes, thank you for the chance to ask a question. Well, I actually wanted to ask something similar to what Anton already said, but I'll just elaborate on this idea. What do you think is the possibility that there will be a debt restructuring for us? Because as it stands right now, it's unlikely, as you said again, that we'll able to cope with this amount of debts that we incurred in the last few years.
Well, I can only repeat what I just said, First of all, it will also depend how long does the war go on, all right? Because as the war goes on, as long as it goes on, of course, the debt level will increase because you do need supply of all sorts of goods services. The second is, and we all hope that one day the war will be over in a not too distant future. The second question is, will the aggressor, in other words, the Russian Federation, also be forced to and accept payments well, I mean, you question this, and I agree with that. It is not guaranteed, but on the other hand, I think the free world wants to make the point that somebody that aggresses, that invades in another neighboring country without any reason, should also pay for the consequence. Now, whether this will happen or not, we don't know. Okay, and the likelihood is limited. I accept that. So let's concentrate, or let's assume that there will be an end of the war one way or the other, and armistice, or hopefully even a peace treatment one day, and then there won't be massive financial flows coming from Russia. You may be, or the Western world has confiscated some assets that belong to the Russian Republic and even to oligarchs, etc. But it will legally, it will not be that easy to simply shift them from one country to the other. So I can only repeat what I said. I guess that there will be how do you call it? We had, after the Second World War, we had the Marshall Plan in Europe that came from America, but that was also credit based. It was not a gift as such. It was credit based, and the last installments were paid back to the U.S. just 10 years ago, or 8 years ago. So that is I personally think that, at least as far as Europe is concerned, you will see that a large part of the money that has been given to the Ukraine will be forgiven, will be turned into a gift, so to speak, or into will be considered financial aid without the requirement to pay it back. That I think. The USA, I don't know. I can't speak for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Artyom. And just now, please, Vladislava, your question.
Yeah, I also have a question about the debt that Ukraine will seek in the future. As guys have asked before, how do you think how long it will take for us to repay back the amount of money that, for example, will not be forgiven by EU and USA? And yeah, how it will influence our country, because I understand that we have already an inflation and we will have it increase in the future, but how long will it take for us to, I don't know, to make the economy more or less stable and at the same time to repay the debt?
Well, that's, as I say, there are so many points that will determine this, which we do not know today. I mean, we do not know when will the war end, on what basis will it end. Will it be just an armistice and end of the fighting, or will it really be will it really be a peace treatment? In other words, a contract or a treaty that the Ukraine signs with the Russian Federation. We don't know this, For the time being, it doesn't look as if the Russian Federation is interested in ending the war in one way or the other, let alone signing a peace treaty. We don't know. The second point is, we want, as you know, the Ukraine to become part of the European Union. And this will take a number of years. It's not for tomorrow or the year after tomorrow, but it is the objective that we want. And I'm sure that if the Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, that the European Union has an interest in putting the Ukraine on a stable financial footing. Because otherwise, if you become member of the European Union, but you are completely broken, then of course that would not be the basis for developing a good future. So I think the moment you become member of the European Union, the question of the debts will have to be settled one way or the other. And there are several possibilities. I think some of the debt will be forgiven. Which percentage? I don't know. Some of the debt will be repackaged. In other words, very much like in Greece, we will say, this you don't have to pay back now or tomorrow, but you have 50 years, 50, long term, 2 generations, okay? So that given the development of the economy, growth development, inflation development, de facto, it is a large gift as well. If you have to pay back the debt in 50 years, it's a long period. When it comes to the debt of the US, I don't know. Also, the US is giving you also financial aid, but of course you use that financial aid to buy weapons in America. So the US in a way subsidizes the American weapon industry. So they get a lot of content, and also the money that we give you, as if you use it again to buy weapons, most of the weapons are manufactured in America. When you take the 10 largest arms factories in the world, 9 are US and 1 is Chinese, and there's not a single European in there. So you see that most of the money that you get, if you use it for weapons, you spend it in America. So come back. I think it depends when the war will end, what sort of treaty you will have, just an armistice or peace treaty. And when there's clarity as to when the Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, then I think that question of that will be definitely settled one way or the other. And I can see that it will be forgiven, one, and repackaged and become a debt that will have to be repaid in 2 generations.
Thank you for your answer. I would also like to ask you another question. You said that we all know that we would like to become a part of European Union, and European Union gives us such possibility. What would you, for example, say how it is better to, in this case, if we become a part of European Union, to act with our currency? For example, in Poland, they haven't changed it, but in Spain, in Germany, in other countries, it is only euro. So how it would better to leave our currency, to have the same currency as we have now, and just like working on balancing it like Poland did? Or would it be better to have a euro?
Well, that is not, the answer is not that easy. I think Poland has done quite well in keeping the zloty for a number of years. Eventually, they are all member states, with the exception of Denmark, are all committed and legally bound to introduce the euro. They have, they have signed the treaty that they will eventually introduce the euro. When this will happen, I don't know. I know what they do now with the politicians, they listen to the opinion of the people. And if they feel the majority of the citizens want to keep the zloty or the crown in Czechia, then they do so. Other countries like Croatia just introduced the euro at the beginning of this year. Bulgaria wants to introduce it next year or the year after. So others are interested in introducing. I think, as I said before, it's not just a question of whether you want to introduce or not. You have to meet certain criteria. Your debt level has to be balanced. You have to have a certain economic development. You have to have an inflation rate that is not worse than 1.5% of the three best countries of the member states. So I think when you become a member of the European Union, it will take a number of years until you also would introduce the euro. I mean, the euro, if it survives, which we all hope, is the second largest currency in the world now, following the dollar, and it means that you have no possibility, for instance, if you want to improve your competitiveness by devaluating the currency, you can't do this. And when you are joining the European Union, you are still in a catching up phase. You want to catch up with the economy of the other member states, and it could well be that you have an interest in not introducing a very strong currency right away. Maybe you want to have the possibility to have monetary independence and also not have only fiscal sovereignty, but also monetary sovereignty for a number of years. So I would guess that if you join the European Union, say in 2030, you would not introduce the euro right away. It would be a number of years, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.
Eventually, you will have to.
Thank you very much for the answer.
I wish you well. Have a nice day, and I hope that you can go on and finish your studies in a somewhat peaceful environment. I mean, Kiev is not as bad as other parts of the country, but it's dangerous nonetheless. I mean, we see it here, and I can say we feel with you. We think it's dramatic in these days, in the 21st century, to be all of a sudden invaded by a neighbor that you have had close ties with in the past, and even families have etc. To me, it's impossible, but okay, that's the way it is.